Have you ever wondered how a single assumption can place an innocent person in handcuffs before anyone takes the time to verify the truth? That question began to answer itself just after 7 o'clock on a quiet Tuesday morning in Maple Ridge, a peaceful suburban neighborhood less than an hour outside Washington, D.C., where tree-lined streets, well-kept front lawns, and familiar faces usually meant everyone felt safe. At exactly 7:05 a.m., Marcus Bennett stepped out of his mother's front door carrying a leather briefcase in one hand and a travel mug of coffee in the other. His government-issued SUV waited in the driveway, parked exactly where it had been every week since he began visiting his mother after his father's passing. Mrs. Eleanor Bennett stood on the porch, smiling as she reminded her son not to work too hard, and Marcus answered with the same gentle laugh he always used whenever she worried about him. Before he could reach the driver's door, a black and white patrol cruiser rolled slowly to the curb with its emergency lights flashing briefly before fading. Officer Daniel Brooks, a white patrol officer with several years on the department, stepped out and studied Marcus without saying a word for several seconds. The silence itself felt heavier than any accusation. Finally, Brooks spoke in a calm but unmistakably suspicious tone. He explained that dispatch had received a call about a suspicious man lingering around the property, and someone in the neighborhood believed the individual might be attempting to break into the home. Marcus looked around the quiet street before looking back at the officer. His expression remained composed, showing neither anger nor fear. He politely explained that he was leaving after visiting his mother and had been there since early that morning. Mrs. Bennett immediately stepped forward from the porch and confirmed exactly what Marcus had said. She smiled kindly toward the officer and explained that Marcus was her son, that he visited every Tuesday before driving to Washington for work, and that nothing unusual was happening. Brooks acknowledged her statement with a short nod, but his attention never truly left Marcus. Instead of accepting the explanation, he asked where Marcus worked. Marcus answered honestly, but carefully. He simply said that he worked in public service in Washington. Brooks glanced toward the government vehicle before returning his eyes to Marcus. Rather than asking another clarifying question, he seemed to interpret every ordinary detail as another reason for suspicion. Marcus calmly reached toward his jacket and said he could present identification immediately if the officer wished to verify everything. Before Marcus could move another inch, Brooks raised one hand and instructed him not to reach into his pocket. Marcus stopped instantly, keeping both hands visible. The neighborhood remained quiet as another government SUV passed through a nearby intersection without slowing, unnoticed by everyone on the street. Marcus looked directly at Brooks and spoke with quiet confidence. "Officer, I believe you're making a decision before giving yourself the opportunity to verify the truth. The next few minutes may become far more important than either of us expects." Officer Daniel Brooks kept his eyes fixed on Marcus Bennett, as though every calm answer only deepened his suspicion instead of resolving it. He took one slow step closer and asked for Marcus's full address. Marcus answered without hesitation, giving the same Maple Ridge Drive address where they were standing and explaining that his mother had lived there for more than 30 years. Mrs. Eleanor Bennett quietly confirmed every word, adding that several neighbors had watched Marcus grow up before he eventually accepted a federal position in Washington. Brooks listened, but his expression did not change. Instead, he asked why Marcus drove a government-issued vehicle if he was simply visiting family before work. Marcus replied in the same respectful tone that he had used from the beginning. He explained that his schedule required him to travel directly to official meetings after leaving his mother's home, and that using his assigned vehicle was part of his normal responsibilities. Brooks looked at the sport utility vehicle again, studying the government license plate for several moments before returning his attention to Marcus. Rather than viewing the explanation as confirmation that everything was consistent, he appeared to treat the vehicle itself as another unanswered question. Marcus remained patient. He repeated that he was willing to present identification immediately if the officer would simply allow him to retrieve his wallet safely. Once again, Brooks instructed him not to reach into his pockets. Marcus immediately complied, keeping both hands visible without showing even the slightest sign of frustration. Mrs. Bennett looked increasingly concerned and softly asked the officer whether there had been some misunderstanding. Brooks answered that he was only trying to determine whether the information he had been given was accurate and that he needed to make sure everyone was telling the truth. Marcus nodded politely. That is exactly why I have offered my identification several times, he said. Verification answers questions much faster than assumptions. Brooks did not respond. Instead, he asked Marcus where exactly he worked in Washington. Marcus answered honestly while protecting information that was not necessary for the situation. I work in federal public service, he said calmly. My responsibilities require discretion, but my identity can be verified without difficulty. Those words seemed to reinforce Brooks's doubts rather than ease them. In his mind, every careful answer sounded incomplete, and every incomplete answer appeared suspicious. Across the street, a passing neighbor slowed briefly before continuing on, sensing that something unusual was happening but unable to hear the conversation. At exactly 7:11 a.m., several miles away in Washington, a routine administrative monitoring system quietly noted that Director Bennett had not completed a scheduled arrival confirmation normally received before an early secure briefing. The missed confirmation did not immediately trigger an emergency, but it prompted an analyst to begin checking routine travel information. Back on Maple Ridge Drive, neither Marcus nor Officer Brooks had any idea that a separate timeline had quietly begun moving in the background. As another government vehicle turned onto a nearby boulevard before disappearing from sight, Marcus looked steadily at the officer and spoke with the same calm confidence that had never left him. There is an important difference, he said, between investigating the facts and building a story before the facts have been verified. Marcus Bennett remained exactly where he was, his hands still visible and his expression calm despite the growing tension that surrounded the quiet driveway. Officer Daniel Brooks studied him for another long moment before instructing him to step away from the government-issued sport utility vehicle and stand near the edge of the driveway, where he could be observed more easily. Marcus complied immediately without hesitation. He carefully placed his leather briefcase on the concrete beside him and slowly stepped back exactly as instructed. Mrs. Eleanor Bennett watched from the porch with increasing concern, but Marcus gave her a reassuring glance that silently asked her to remain calm. Brooks circled the vehicle, examining the exterior, the government license plates, and the windshield permit without attempting to verify any of the official markings through dispatch. Instead, he returned to Marcus and repeated the same questions in slightly different forms, asking why someone in federal public service would be visiting the neighborhood so early and why his explanation seemed intentionally vague. Marcus answered with the same patience he had shown from the beginning. He explained that many government positions required discretion, but verification of his identity was simple if Brooks would permit him to retrieve his identification. Once again, Brooks declined the offer, insisting that Marcus keep his hands where they could be seen until he completed his assessment. Marcus nodded respectfully. "I understand your concern for safety, officer," he said evenly. "I only hope the same level of concern is being given to confirming the facts." Brooks did not respond. Instead, he leaned toward the front windshield, writing down the vehicle registration number in his notebook before briefly speaking into his shoulder radio. The dispatch operator acknowledged the transmission, but no request was made to verify Marcus's identity through the identification he had repeatedly offered to present. At exactly 7:18 a.m., inside a secure federal operations center in Washington, the analyst monitoring Director Bennett's morning schedule noticed that a second routine communication had also gone unanswered. Under normal circumstances, a delayed response would not immediately raise concern, but the combination of two missed confirmations fell outside established travel patterns. The analyst quietly notified Assistant Director James Holloway that Director Bennett had not acknowledged either scheduled contact. Holloway reviewed the information without showing alarm, but he immediately requested the last confirmed location from the Protective Travel Coordination System. Within moments, the records identified Maple Ridge Drive as Director Bennett's final verified destination before his expected departure toward Washington. Back outside the Bennett residence, Brooks continued examining the parked government vehicle instead of verifying the identity of the man standing only a few feet away. Marcus remained composed, understanding that arguing would accomplish nothing. He simply watched the officer complete another page of notes while valuable minutes quietly disappeared. Neither Brooks nor Mrs. Bennett knew that multiple federal employees were now reviewing travel records, communication logs, and vehicle data in an effort to understand why one of the nation's senior law enforcement officials had unexpectedly vanished from his normal morning routine. What still appeared to be an ordinary neighborhood investigation was already beginning to move far beyond the boundaries of Maple Ridge Drive. Officer Daniel Brooks closed his notebook and looked toward his patrol vehicle before returning his attention to Marcus Bennett. The morning air remained still, and the quiet neighborhood seemed almost untouched by the tension that had slowly taken control of the driveway. Brooks informed Marcus that, because he had not been able to confirm his identity to his satisfaction, he would be transported to the Maple County Police Department until everything could be sorted out. Marcus listened without interrupting. After a brief pause, he nodded once. "I will cooperate," he said calmly. "I only ask that the facts be verified as soon as possible." Brooks acknowledged the response, but remained convinced he was making the correct decision. Marcus turned toward the front porch where Mrs. Eleanor Bennett stood with visible concern on her face. She stepped closer, asking whether there was anything she could do to help clear up what she believed was an obvious misunderstanding. Marcus offered her a reassuring smile that reflected years of professional discipline. "Everything will be all right," he told her gently. "Please do not worry. The truth has a way of reaching the right people." Mrs. Bennett reluctantly nodded, although the uncertainty in her eyes remained. At approximately 7:22 a.m., Marcus collected his briefcase only after receiving permission to do so, carefully keeping every movement slow and deliberate. Brooks directed him toward the patrol vehicle while another government-issued sport utility vehicle briefly passed through a nearby intersection before continuing toward the highway. Neither driver noticed the scene unfolding only a short distance away. As the patrol vehicle pulled away from Maple Ridge Drive, the peaceful neighborhood returned to its normal routine, leaving only Mrs. Bennett standing quietly on her porch, watching until the cruiser disappeared from view. Nearly 40 miles away in Washington, Assistant Director James Holloway had already assembled a small coordination team to review the unusual communication gap involving Director Bennett. Initial checks confirmed that 2 scheduled secure contacts had been missed, something that had never happened without prior notice. Holloway remained composed, resisting any impulse to reach premature conclusions. Instead, he instructed analysts to follow established continuity procedures and verify every available data point before escalating the situation further. Within minutes, the travel coordination system confirmed that Director Bennett's government vehicle had departed according to schedule but had not continued along its expected route toward Washington. Based on that information, Holloway authorized the activation of the Protective Continuity Protocol, a precautionary process designed to account for senior federal officials whose normal travel patterns unexpectedly changed without explanation. Analysts immediately began comparing vehicle location data, communication records, and local emergency dispatch activity occurring near the last confirmed location. The information slowly started forming a picture that none of them had expected. Back inside the patrol vehicle, Marcus remained silent, looking out the passenger window as familiar neighborhoods gradually gave way to the streets leading toward the county station. Brooks believed he was transporting an unidentified individual for further verification. Marcus understood that every opportunity to resolve the misunderstanding had already been offered and declined. Now the outcome would depend not on opinions or assumptions, but on the evidence that was already beginning to move quietly through channels neither man could yet see. The patrol vehicle turned into the parking lot of the Maple County Police Department at approximately 7:46 a.m., and Officer Daniel Brooks parked near the entrance reserved for routine processing. Marcus Bennett stepped out only after Brooks instructed him to do so, carrying himself with the same calm professionalism that had defined every moment since the encounter began. Employees arriving for the morning shift glanced briefly toward the pair before continuing inside, unaware that what appeared to be an ordinary police matter was quietly becoming something far more significant. Brooks escorted Marcus through the front doors and into the booking area, where Captain Robert Hayes happened to be reviewing overnight reports before the morning briefing. Without interrupting his work, Hayes asked Brooks for a brief explanation of the situation. Brooks stated that he had responded to a suspicious person call involving an individual outside a residence, that the subject claimed to work in federal public service, and that he had been unable to verify the individual's identity to his satisfaction. Hayes looked toward Marcus, who stood quietly with both hands visible and his briefcase resting beside his feet. "Sir, would you please tell me your name?" Hayes asked in a professional tone. Marcus answered immediately. "My name is Marcus Bennett. I work in federal public service in Washington, and I repeatedly offered to present my identification before leaving the residence. Officer Brooks instructed me not to retrieve it." Hayes shifted his attention back toward Brooks for a brief moment, but said nothing. Instead, he asked Marcus whether he was still willing to provide identification if requested. Marcus nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely. I have been willing from the very beginning." Before Hayes could respond, Brooks explained that he believed additional verification remained necessary because Marcus had been intentionally vague regarding the exact nature of his position. Marcus answered calmly without raising his voice. "I chose discretion, not deception. My position does not prevent lawful verification. In fact, verification has been available throughout this entire encounter." Hayes made a short note while considering both accounts. Something about the timeline seemed incomplete, although he had not yet reached any conclusion. At exactly 7:53 a.m., inside the Federal Coordination Center in Washington, analysts completed another review of travel records connected to Director Bennett's government vehicle. Location information, communication logs, and nearby emergency dispatch activity now pointed toward a single destination. Assistant Director James Holloway examined the report for only a few seconds before giving a clear instruction. "Prepare a response team. We are going to Maple County Police Department." Within moments, Special Agent Olivia Carter joined the coordination effort as several federal vehicles departed the secured facility under standard response procedures. No emergency lights were activated because there was still no evidence of immediate danger, only a growing need to verify the director's unexpected location. Back inside the station, Captain Hayes quietly requested that dispatch forward the original call details along with every report associated with the encounter. He wanted the complete record before making any further decisions. Marcus remained patient, saying nothing more than necessary while Brooks continued believing that caution justified every step he had taken. Outside the station, the sound of several approaching engines gradually became noticeable as a small convoy of government vehicles entered the final stretch of road leading directly toward the department. At exactly 8:01 a.m., the sound of several engines echoed across the parking lot as a convoy of dark government-issued sport utility vehicles came to a smooth stop outside the Maple County Police Department. The vehicles did not arrive with flashing lights or dramatic urgency. Instead, every movement reflected quiet confidence and careful coordination. Inside the station, Captain Robert Hayes looked toward the front entrance as several professionally dressed federal officials entered together. Leading the group was Assistant Director James Holloway, followed closely by Special Agent Olivia Carter and several other federal agents. Their expressions remained calm, focused, and businesslike. A receptionist approached to ask whether she could assist them, but Holloway answered before she finished speaking. "Good morning. We are here regarding Director Marcus Bennett." The room became noticeably quieter. Captain Hayes immediately stepped forward and introduced himself. "I am Captain Robert Hayes. How may I help you?" Holloway maintained steady eye contact. "Our travel coordination system determined that Director Bennett unexpectedly stopped at this location after missing 2 scheduled secure communications. We would like to verify his status immediately." Hayes looked briefly toward Marcus, then back toward Holloway. "Director Bennett?" he repeated carefully. Holloway nodded once. "Director Marcus Bennett, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." For several long seconds, no one spoke. Officer Daniel Brooks stared at Marcus in complete disbelief as every conversation from the past hour suddenly replayed in his mind. The calm answers, the repeated offers to present identification, the government vehicle, the careful choice of words, and the refusal to argue all took on an entirely different meaning. Marcus remained exactly as he had been since the encounter began, composed and respectful. He slowly reached into his jacket only after Hayes gave a clear nod granting permission. Marcus removed a federal credential case and handed it directly to the captain. Hayes examined the identification carefully before comparing it with the information Assistant Director Holloway presented. Every detail matched perfectly. Hayes returned the credential with both hands and spoke in a measured voice. "Director Bennett, thank you for your patience." Marcus accepted the credential with a small nod. Captain, I never wanted my position to end this conversation. I wanted the facts to end it. My title should never determine whether I receive fair treatment. Holloway quietly added. Director Bennett followed established security expectations by protecting sensitive information while repeatedly offering lawful verification. That verification was available throughout this encounter. Brooks lowered his eyes, saying nothing as the full weight of the situation became impossible to ignore. Hayes immediately shifted from uncertainty to responsibility. He instructed a supervisor to preserve every body camera recording connected to the incident, secure all dispatch communications, retain every written report, and document the complete timeline exactly as it occurred. He emphasized that no record was to be altered, omitted, or summarized before a full review. Holloway acknowledged the decision with quiet approval, while Marcus simply stood beside his briefcase, showing no satisfaction that his identity had finally been confirmed. His concern was no longer about himself. It was about whether the same opportunity for fair verification would have been given to someone whose name carried no title at all. Captain Robert Hayes wasted no time after confirming Director Marcus Bennett's identity. He instructed every supervisor on duty to preserve all evidence connected to the encounter exactly as it existed. No report would be edited, no recording would be shortened, and no statement would be finalized until every fact had been reviewed. Within minutes, a conference room became the center of a careful examination that included Captain Hayes, Assistant Director James Holloway, Special Agent Olivia Carter, Officer Daniel Brooks, and Director Bennett himself. The first recording displayed was Brooks's body camera footage from the moment he arrived on Maple Ridge Drive. The room remained completely silent as the video showed Marcus calmly walking toward his government-issued sport utility vehicle while carrying his briefcase and coffee. The recording captured Mrs. Eleanor Bennett immediately identifying Marcus as her son without hesitation. It also recorded Marcus politely offering several times to present identification if he were allowed to retrieve his wallet safely. Each offer had been declined. The recording continued exactly as everyone remembered, but seeing the sequence without assumptions attached produced a very different impression. Hayes paused the footage several times to compare each conversation with the written report that had been submitted only minutes earlier. Next, dispatch communications were reviewed. The original call described a suspicious person standing outside a residence. It contained no report of forced entry, no report of threats, no report of damaged property, and no report that any crime had actually occurred. Hayes quietly compared the dispatch information with Brooks's field decisions and noticed that every opportunity to verify Marcus's explanation had existed from the very beginning. Holloway then reviewed the federal travel timeline. Director Bennett had departed according to schedule, arrived at his mother's residence as planned, and missed 2 secure communications only because the encounter prevented him from continuing toward Washington. Every recorded fact fit together without contradiction. Hayes finally looked toward Brooks. The officer remained silent for several moments before speaking honestly. I believed I was being cautious, he admitted quietly. Looking back at the evidence, I can see that I allowed my first impression to influence every decision that followed. Instead of testing my assumption, I kept looking for information that seemed to support it. No one interrupted him. Marcus looked across the table and answered with the same calm voice he had maintained throughout the morning. Every law enforcement officer faces difficult decisions. The responsibility is not to avoid mistakes completely. The responsibility is to ensure that assumptions never become substitutes for evidence. Holloway nodded in agreement before adding, Director Bennett never asked for special treatment. He repeatedly requested ordinary verification. The standard that protects a federal official should also protect every citizen. Those words settled heavily over the room. Hayes closed the final report folder and looked around the table before speaking. The evidence has made one fact unmistakably clear. The truth was available from the beginning. Our responsibility now is to understand why it was not accepted when it was first offered. Captain Robert Hayes allowed a long silence to settle over the conference room before speaking again. His voice remained steady, carrying the weight of responsibility rather than emotion. The evidence has established the facts, he said. Now our responsibility is to respond with integrity. Officer Daniel Brooks slowly stood from his chair and turned toward Director Marcus Bennett. For the first time that morning, There was no uncertainty in his expression, only sincere reflection. "Director Bennett," he began quietly, "I owe you an apology. I believed I was protecting the community, but I allowed my first impression to influence my judgment before I fully verified the facts. You repeatedly offered me the opportunity to confirm your identity, and I declined. Looking back at everything that happened, I understand that my decisions created a situation that should never have developed the way it did." Marcus listened without interrupting. When Brooks finished, Marcus nodded respectfully before answering. "Officer Brooks, I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge what happened. Accountability begins with honesty, but it cannot end there. Every person deserves to be evaluated according to the facts, not according to assumptions that seem convincing in the moment. My position should never have been the reason this situation changed. The evidence should have been enough long before anyone learned my title." Assistant Director James Holloway looked around the room before adding his own perspective. "The credibility of law enforcement is strengthened every time facts are allowed to guide decisions. Verification is not a sign of weakness. It is one of the strongest protections available to both officers and the communities they serve." Captain Hayes agreed immediately. He announced that the department would begin a formal internal review, not for the purpose of assigning blame alone, but to examine whether existing procedures provided enough emphasis on objective verification before assumptions influenced field decisions. He instructed supervisors to begin developing additional training centered on confirmation of identity, documentation standards, communication with citizens, and recognition of how initial impressions can unintentionally affect professional judgment. Brooks accepted the decision without objection. "If my experience can help prevent this from happening to someone else," he said, "then I wanted to be part of that training." Marcus acknowledged the statement with a small smile. Real improvement is measured by what people choose to learn after recognizing a mistake. The atmosphere inside the room gradually shifted. The tension that had defined the morning was replaced by thoughtful conversation about responsibility, fairness, and public trust. Before concluding the meeting, Captain Hayes personally apologized once more, this time not only as the commanding officer of the department, but also as someone responsible for maintaining confidence in the institution he represented. Marcus accepted the apology with quiet dignity. "Justice is not only about correcting one outcome," he replied. "It is about improving the process so the next person receives fairness before anyone needs to discover who they are." As the meeting ended, supervisors began discussing policy revisions, and the internal review expanded beyond a single encounter, revealing opportunities to strengthen verification procedures throughout the entire department. 3 months later, the events of that Tuesday morning had become far more than a single incident reviewed inside the walls of the Maple County Police Department. The internal review ordered by Captain Robert Hayes had resulted in several policy improvements focused on identity verification, objective decision-making, documentation standards, and communication before conclusions were reached. Supervisors revised field training to emphasize that assumptions could never replace evidence, regardless of how convincing a first impression might appear. During every new officer orientation, body camera footage from the encounter was presented from beginning to end without interruption. Recruits were asked a simple question before the recording concluded. At what point could this situation have been resolved through verification instead of assumption? The answer was always the same. The opportunity had existed from the very beginning. Officer Daniel Brooks continued serving the community, but he also accepted a new responsibility. Rather than avoiding discussion of his mistake, he openly participated in departmental training sessions, explaining how confirmation bias had quietly influenced his judgment without his recognizing it in the moment. He encouraged younger officers to question their own assumptions before questioning someone else's integrity. His willingness to learn became an example that accountability meant more than admitting an error. It meant changing future decisions because of it. Director Marcus Bennett returned to his regular responsibilities in Washington, never requesting recognition or special treatment for what had happened. The experience remained a private reminder that fairness should never depend upon rank, title, or professional position. Several weeks after the review concluded, Mrs. Eleanor Bennett mailed a handwritten letter to Captain Hayes thanking him for ensuring that the department had chosen improvement instead of defensiveness. Hayes framed one sentence from that letter and placed it inside the department training room where every new officer would see it before beginning field assignments. The sentence simply read, "Verify the facts before reaching the conclusion." Late that autumn, Director Bennett accepted an invitation to attend a community outreach event hosted by the department. Families gathered outside the station, children explored patrol vehicles, and officers spoke with residents in an atmosphere built on conversation rather than suspicion. As the event came to an end, Brooks approached Director Bennett and thanked him quietly for the grace he had shown throughout the entire process. Marcus smiled and extended his hand. "Every profession earns trust by learning from its hardest moments," he said. "The goal is never perfection. The goal is choosing the truth quickly enough that fairness is available to everyone." Captain Hayes stood nearby, listening with quiet appreciation as members of the community interacted comfortably with the officers around them. The lessons from that morning had reached far beyond one investigation or one department. Procedures had improved, conversations had changed, and a stronger standard had been established for the future. As Director Bennett prepared to leave, he looked once more at the station before stepping into his government-issued sport utility vehicle. He understood that genuine justice was never measured by a single apology or a single corrected mistake. It was measured by whether the next person, regardless of appearance, background, or title, would be given the dignity of having the truth verified before judgment was ever allowed to take its place.